So this is primarily a good opportunity for me to tell everybody about a migrant disaster victim identification project that we're currently involved in. But I'll give you a little bit of context. Some of the areas involved in this project I can't really speak to, they're not my subject areas, but I'll give you some context to what we're trying to do and hopefully persuade some of you to join this action in relation to migrant disaster victim identification. So, I mean, this is a global crisis, specifically around off the Mediterranean coast. There's over 28,000 recorded deaths of migrants, primarily in boats, since 2014. There's almost certainly a lot more than that, and that's the formal recording of deaths, and many of the bodies, of course, of migrants will not have been found. So it's almost certainly a great deal more than that, and we know a very small number of those are ever identified. But first, before we go into that in detail, I wanted to just give you context for me and how this project has developed. So I, as you've heard, I'm director of a research group called FaceLab, and we're involved in anything to do with faces and skulls and identity and identification. Primarily what we most, well, 99% of what we do now is in the digital arena. And we're also part of a newly established Forensic Research Institute here at the university. People in FaceLab come from very varied backgrounds. It's a slightly multidisciplinary field. So we've got people from anthropology, anatomy, dentistry, art, illustration, CGI, computer science who come and work in FaceLab. And we've got a number of PhD students as well. In relation to this particular project, it came out of some interest in a project from the Canary Islands. So on the last slide, you've seen Dr. Maria Castanero Ruiz, who is Canarian, and she came to work in FaceLab on a project to do with ancient Canarian faces. But in the process, we became interested in the identification of a number of unidentified migrants that are scattered across the Canary Islands, buried in, well, they're not unmarked graves, but their burial sites are without their name because they haven't been identified. And we got some British Academy funding for the Knowledge Frontiers Fund to look at the status of migrant disaster victim identification and to report on that, which we duly did. There's about 250 unidentified bodies buried across the Canary Islands, and most of those are from Senegal, who have died in boats trying to get across to Europe. Following on from that, we had a collaboration with the University of Milan, Cristina Cattaneo and her group there, and the Forensic Missing Migrants Initiative, based in Greece, and the University of Thrace, based in Alexandropoli. And we have been working with them for the past few years, trying to help with their disaster victim identification. Most of the work we've been doing with them has been involved in deaths over land, so people crossing from Turkey, well, from Syria through Turkey overland and dying usually of exposure, trying to get into Europe from Greece. But some of those have also come through the boat disasters. So we know that only, well, at the most 20% of migrant disaster victims are ever identified. And the International Organization for Migration is collecting data along with ICMP. And we primarily looked at whether or not we could use craniofacial analysis to help with some of this identification. Speaking to Cristina at the University of Milan, we became aware that facial detail is one of the ways that most migrants who are identified. So comparison of ante-mortem and post-mortem faces. So that's why we started looking into whether or not we could produce images and a website that will help, because there are a number of challenges associated with migrant deaths, which I'll come to in a moment, which means that the usual channels are not very helpful. And we've been producing images much like this in black and white, with some detail highlighting the areas of the face that may be important for identification purposes. And we're developing currently a website with the university and the platform for Transnational Forensic Assistance. So then, what are the challenges specific to migrant disaster victim identification? And we've deliberately decided to call it disaster victim identification. And the reason we've done that is because Interpol does not necessarily consider this a disaster or disaster victim identification. And certainly the DVI responses are very different in different countries and from Interpol itself in relation to migrants. And that's because it's not a single event. It tends to be, it can be, but it tends to be a lot of events culminating in a number of migrant deaths. So some of the challenges are that bodies are often either severely decomposed if they're on land, and if they're in water, they may also be water damaged. Once migrant disaster happens, especially at sea, there is usually no further search to find bodies. It's just dealing with the bodies that wash up on the coast or are found on land. What we found, certainly in the Canary Islands and through speaking to Interpol DVI experts, there's no real standard procedure for what happens in those European countries where the bodies wash up in relation to the police response and the coroner's response. And certainly the records that are kept in relation to missing migrants from the countries of origin are not very detailed, and I'll come into why in a moment. Many illegal migrants don't carry identity documents, or if they do, they may not be, they may be false identity documents, and it may not be possible to retrieve DNA from the bodies, either from a water damage perspective or from a resourcing perspective. And what we found is that the Interpol, the pink and yellow forms that are used for DVI may not be the most appropriate forms for looking at deceased migrants for these reasons. In terms of the migrants, the missing migrants themselves, most of them tend to be young men, although there is a growing number of young women who are also taking these routes. We don't have full records from the countries of origin, and that's because either the countries of origin don't recognise that these migration routes, or don't want to recognise these migration routes, or because they don't have the resources to be able to collect that information. We know that families often fear criminal reprisals or arrests if they go to the authorities about their missing relatives that they know have migrated. And there's, in some countries, a certain amount of shame related to having a missing person in the family who may have left the country. In addition, in many of these countries, and we're talking about North Africa and Syria and other areas in the Middle East, families may not trust the police or the government organisations, so they're not willing to give information about their missing relatives to those organisations, so that information is never collected in a formal way. In addition to that, although families may want to know what has happened to their missing relative, they may not necessarily want the body to be returned, because that may incur cost for them, both in terms of repatriation, but also in terms of a funeral. It isn't always possible to collect DNA or dental records of the missing person from the family, or even familial DNA, partly through this trust element in relation to authority, and partly because they just may not have those records or the facilities to collect that information. So again, the Interpol forms for missing migrants may not be the most appropriate way of consolidating, reconciling this ante-mortem and post-mortem data. But there are a number of opportunities for disaster victim identification specifically for migrants. So we know that many migrants have smartphones on them as they migrate, even in dangerous situations, and even where they're handing over a great deal of money to their traffickers. And many of them who have smartphones also have social media accounts, and their phones have GPS. So some of this information, this digital data, may be really useful for identification purposes if we can get around the data protection issues that are associated with accessing some of that information. Although families don't trust the police or government authorities, they do tend to contact and trust non-government organisations and charities that are working in the missing persons arena. So platforms like the Missing Persons Initiative in Greece, they're dealing directly with family and friends of the missing people. They also, in some circumstances, are dealing with other migrants. So, for example, some of these charities and organisations are getting calls from migrants who have seen dead bodies on their route of migration, tell them, take a photograph, send it with GPS coordinates to the platforms and tell them there's a body there, so that those platforms can then inform the police and those bodies can be recovered. And that puts those platforms in quite a difficult legal situation as well, being given that information, but that they would rather do that than contact the police. It may be in these circumstances where DNA, dental, fingerprints are not possible and they're the primary identifiers used in DVI, that some secondary identification could become important. And we know this from some of the ante-mortem, post-mortem facial comparison work. So craniofacial analysis may be important. Body modifications such as tattoos, scars, all of those things that may be idiosyncratic, some personal effects, and any medical records to do with previous surgery or previous dental treatment, etc. And these are what, in a usual DVI situation, may not lead to identification because they're not primary forms of identification, but in these cases can be really significant for the identification process. There also appears to be opportunity for AI and machine learning in this arena for the consolidation, the reconciliation of ante-mortem and post-mortem data, and perhaps for some of the other methods that are being used. And then on top of that, there can likely be some opportunities for technology. And most of that I'm aware of seems to be in relation to search and discovery of migrants, dead migrants, or of where disasters have happened. And that's through drones, robots, sensors, GPS locators, etc. So with that in mind, we put together with a number of, I think 17 European members put together an application for a cost action. So COST is the European Cooperation in Science and Technology, and they fund what they describe as actions, which are really networking projects. They don't fund specific research, but they fund events that may lead to research collaborations and research applications. And our action that we submitted last year has been successful, and we have funding for 4 years from COST for this particular migrant disaster victim identification action. So the action includes research and innovators from higher education institutes, NGOs, non-government organisations, charities, people from industry, small to medium enterprises, anybody who's working in the migrant disaster victim identification field who may be able to help move this forward and progress this kind of crisis project. So the interdisciplinary research initiatives we're trying to coordinate that were named in the network are craniofacial, AI, drone and social media. However, that doesn't mean that the action is going to be limited to that. Those are just the ones we named in the action, and what we want is to bring people in from lots of different backgrounds to perhaps collaborate together to provide new innovation in terms of methods, and also to help in terms of policy and changing international policy into how migrant disasters are viewed. And we do have, this is mainly a European group because it's funded through a European funding body, but we do have other international partners from South Africa and Senegal, and people from all over the world are welcome to join the action and to take part in the working group. So what cost fund are these events, either in person or online or hybrid, where collaboration and the production of standards and policies can be produced. So this is the website for our particular action, the Migrant Disaster Victim Identification Action. And our drive is to coordinate initiatives, so meetings, training schools, short-term scientific missions, online resources that will encourage interdisciplinary research and new innovation, and to look at driving the development of processes, resources, capability enhancement across Europe, and driving these new methods into the DVI process. We're setting up a training school to enhance capability in what costs describe as ITC countries, so countries with lower capability across Europe. At the moment, our first meeting for the management committee is going to be at the beginning of October. The action formally starts in November. Right now, we've got more than 80 people who've applied to be part of the working groups from more than 25 countries. We will get approximately 600,000 euros over 4 years to fund this. And we have 4 working groups that will be developing different aspects of migrant disaster victim identification. So our working groups are looking at physical evidence, digital evidence, international policy, and then the continued professional development program, so our training school. And the reason I didn't split this, or we didn't split this into ante-mortem and post-mortem, is because what applies in one area may also apply in another. And actually the different sorts of evidence may be more important than whether or not it's taken from a dead person or a living person. So that gives you some background in terms of the cost action. And I please would encourage everybody who has something to offer in terms of contribution for this to go onto the website and apply to join one of the working groups. That you can find that on the right-hand side of the website. I'll come back to that later though. So then just a bit of background in terms of one aspect of that, because I'm not an expert in AI, in social media or in drones and robots, but my expertise is in craniofacial identification. So I'm going to just give you a little bit of background about that and how that can be useful in a migrant disaster victim identification scenario. So why would we use craniofacial identification? So I've already mentioned DNA analysis may not be possible. There may not be dental records available for individuals, and the police may have absolutely no candidates in relation to who this could be. They have no idea who they're looking at all, where they're from or who they are in any sense. Fingerprinting isn't always possible, and certainly fingerprints are only useful, and dental and DNA are only useful if you've got something to compare to. We also know that there are many problems to do with recognizing people once they're dead from visual recognition by family or friends. I'm sure These images are not new to anybody, but then I put them up to illustrate how difficult it is to recognise someone, even someone you're very familiar with, when shown a post-mortem image or viewing them in post-mortem. So even immediately after death, it may be very difficult to recognise somebody you know extremely well. And some of that is related to the emotional reasons of recognition, and some of that is related to the changes that happen to a face post-mortem, either immediately or obviously the more decomposed a person becomes, the more difficult it is to identify them. So we know that after the Asian tsunami, 10% of the victims were wrongly identified by family and friends based on visual recognition of the bodies. And in the Asian tsunami, there were hundreds of thousands of people. So we're talking about tens of thousands of misidentifications. We know in the Bali bombings that half of the victims were wrongly identified by family and friends. So this misidentification from body vision is very common and well recognised in the field. So we need to, if we're using faces as a way of identifying people, and that's a good way of identifying people if we have the right information, then we need to be comparing them in a different way than using family and friends to recognise them from viewing. So, as I've mentioned, we can use craniofacial identification methods in mass disasters. We can compare to a missing persons list with some techniques, or we can use it as a way of getting names from which the ordinary methods of identification can be used. So some craniofacial methods may be a form of identification, and others may be just a way of getting names for the police to identify through other methods. The methods that are most useful in relation to this are these 5. So morphological analysis is what we call the shape and size comparison between ante-mortem and post-mortem faces, usually done from images, and that relies on detail of faces in terms of moles, scars, hair patterns, idiosyncratic detail on the face for comparing between ante-mortem and post-mortem images. And this is where the use of social media could be useful. If we can retrieve images, living images of the faces in close-up taken with mobile phones, and that could help to compare to the post-mortem images of faces for detail. And this is some of the work we've been doing in Greece with migrant DVI. And there's what's as a similar part of this, what's called facial superimposition, which is the comparison of a post-mortem face with an ante-mortem image, and that's usually a 3D to a 2D comparison. This usually supplements morphological analysis, and it can be useful where we've got 3D scanners at a scene, for example. And then there's what's called, which I'm sure you're all aware of, craniofacial superimposition, which is the comparison of a skull with an ante-mortem image of the suspected candidate. There's what's called post-mortem depiction and facial reconstruction or approximation, and all of these methods are more about getting names than they are about identification. So they're both an interpretation of facial appearance, living facial appearance, in order to get recognition by family and friends. And that may be from partially decomposed soft tissues, and we call that post-mortem depiction, or it may be from skeletal detail, in which case we call it facial reconstruction or approximation. And there are a number of bits of research that have been carried out that supplement all of these areas. So the ante-mortem to post-mortem morphological comparison, there's been a number of bits of research looking at that. These photographs, by the way, are from a Wellcome collection exhibition by an artist, a photographer called Walter Schells, who photographed people with their consent before and after they died, which make a good example to show you here. And to say that what we're looking at here is detail on the face, rather than overall face shape and feature shape. We're looking at detail on the face that will help with identification. And there's some evidence that this is a very useful method for disaster victim identification. We have a recent study, the last one on the list there, looking at the reliability of post-mortem to ante-mortem facial comparisons. And the results of that were extremely positive, with a 100% correct identification rate, comparing a small number of post-mortem subjects to a larger face pool of ante-mortem images. Then there's this facial superimposition, so looking at 3D data from the deceased face and comparing that with ante-mortem data of the living face. And this example I'm showing you is a comparison of John Dillinger's death mask with ante-mortem photographs of him. He was an infamous criminal from the US, in case you've never heard of him. And what we can do is take a scan, in this case of his death mask, and take that into a computer system and superimpose that with usually a number of photographs, ante-mortem images of the same individual, or the individual, to identify them. In this particular case, we had about 30 photographs of John Dillinger in life. He was well photographed, and it matched very well. The study I mentioned with the 100% success rate of ante-mortem post-mortem comparison did use some of this method within that study. Forgive me for using your images here, but this is a craniofacial superimposition. I'm sure you're all aware of the softwares that are available for comparing skulls to faces, and the research that's been carried out looking at the reliability and evaluation of that you can see in the handbook. So I won't go into that in any detail, but this is quite a well-used technique within forensic investigation. Usually for us in the UK, it's more of a method for giving the police some confirmation before they approach the family. So if you have a missing person in your family, it's very distressing to be constantly told by the police, oh, we found a body, it could be a relative, oh no, it's not. Repeatedly, that can be quite a distressing process. So the police like to be relatively certain before they approach the family to get other information to confirm identity. And that's where this can be quite useful. It's not really a method of identification in court in the UK, maybe elsewhere, but it can be a useful investigative tool for police. It's certainly exceptionally good for excluding people, although not the best method from single images for identifying. There's a little bit of research around post-mortem depiction, looking at how bodies decompose and whether there are patterns of decomposure that can help us to predict facial feature from partially decomposed remains. Certainly this is a method that is used primarily in countries who do not want to put out images of the dead, but do, where there's enough of the face to be able to identify if someone recognises them, they'll often ask for us to take that image of the dead, to open the eyes, to make it look like a living person, to get rid of debris, to highlight the areas of the face that might be important for recognition, and then to put that out to the public instead of putting out a distressing image of a deceased body. And then, of course, there's what we describe as facial reconstruction or approximation. This is a very long-standing process that's been used in forensic casework since the early 20th century. And there are a number of developed automated systems. There are a number of evaluations that have been carried out using both automated and manual systems. Some of those, or most of those, will rely in some way in terms of tissue depth data as part of the process. This is sets of average data from across the face, from across different parts of the world. And we also rely on much larger than this. These are just examples of standards that we use for predicting facial features from skeletal assessment. And some of those have been written into working group procedures for practitioners, but certainly this is well used within forensic investigation. In terms of evaluating accuracy, there are rates for the number of cases that are identified. Certainly it's a good tool for generating leads depending on the countries. In the UK, it's very good for generating leads. In the US, I think less so, and that's maybe just to do with the size of the country that's where we're looking. This is not a very good way of looking at evaluating accuracy though, but can tell you about the effectiveness. For accuracy, we need to look at laboratory studies, and we've been able to do that through looking at some donated bodies in taphonomy institutes, looking at living donors and giving mostly computer tomography data for the blind studies. And we can assess the accuracy of these techniques through either geometric comparisons or using automated face recognition systems. So we've done that a number of times, not just me, other people in this field around the world. This is just one example where we've used living data and then we've compared it geometrically in terms of the surface of the reconstruction with the surface of the actual individual. And we know that about 67% of the surface of the reconstruction has less than 2 millimeters of error. And that's been repeated on different populations around the world using different sets of data. There also exist evaluation studies of automated systems. This is some of them. They do tend to produce leave one out comparisons, which may not be the best way to evaluate some of the systems, but nonetheless, these are results for you to see. We have also tested the use of facial depiction from human remains in a DVI scenario. So you may be familiar with the FAST-ID project, and this was European funded. It was a much bigger project looking at the whole DVI process, but one small part of that I was involved in was craniofacial identification. So we produced a number of facial reconstructions from donated data, and we produced a fake missing persons database that we compared to using a face recognition system, the Viola-Jones algorithm, in case anyone's interested. That is a shape-only comparison. And we were looking to see if this could be used as a way of filtering in a DVI situation with mass fatalities. What we found, we had 143 faces in our fake missing persons database. And we found that our reconstructions, when compared to the database, were in the top 20% of that database in terms of matches. And that was found a number of different, we tested it a number of different ways, with a number of different faces and a number of different populations, and got the same result. The cases that didn't get into the top 20% of the matches were the ones that were edentulous, that didn't have teeth. So we know that that's a problem for facial depiction from human remains. Without teeth, it's much more difficult to get a match using facial recognition software. And probably the most difficult area for us in terms of craniofacial depiction is not shape. So we know exactly how accurate we are at predicting shape from skeletal assessment. But shape isn't the only thing that informs recognition of faces. And what we call texture, the additions of colour and detail, the thing that makes it look not like a model and more like a photograph, that can actually be much more important when it comes to recognition. And there are a number of studies that have looked at how we present faces and the best ways that we can present faces in a DVI situation. So I end on this again with the plea for people to join this cost action if you have anything to contribute in relation to migrant DVI processes. And thank you very much for your time.